video of the second part of Book 10 of Paradise Lost, which I call Consolation of a Broken God, a preview of Paradise Lost 10/7/20 to 11:04. I'm actually going to focus on a single speech, which I have thought has been underlooked, understudied, and underappreciated since I first read this poem a long time ago. I will quickly summarize this section of the poem. I'd like you to mark your books if possible, if you're my students. If you're not my students, you can do whatever you want. Um, Really importantly, from 7:20 to 8:44, and this is what we'll be focusing on. Adam gives a very famous soliloquy. I shouldn't say it's famous, it's not one of the most discussed ones, and it stands out to me for different reasons. He's now cursed with mortality, and he's wrestling on his own with what that means. And he's able to deduce the immortality of his soul all by himself, just thinking. I always have thought it's amazing. I think Eve's amazing. I think Satan's amazing. I don't think it's a one person story or a one demon story. I think there's a lot of amazing, rich characters, and Adam's one of them here. Secondly, after the fall, the Adam Eve relationship is full of tension. So 867 to 908, we have a little argument. Eve then supplicates, which we know from the Iliad and the Odyssey is when a person in complete abject humility wraps their arms against a person's ankles to show how subservient and how sort of obedient they are to them and how in need they are of them. She supplicates and admits that the fault was hers. Adam loves her, even in his broken way, and admits that he wishes he could take all the punishment for himself, which sounds like love. Eve proposes actually a really interesting thought, which Adam had considered earlier in his soliloquy, which is if we're going to uh, fight sin and death, well, why don't we not procreate a bunch of other people that they can destroy? Why don't we kill ourselves? And Adam helps guide her through why that's a bad idea, basically contextualizing their circumstances. And the section of the poem ends predictably with them agreeing to fall on God's mercy, something that frankly Satan and the demons couldn't do. Satan's this close. He knows God's capable of mercy. He can't bend the knee. It seems like Adam and Eve are in a different place spiritually. Okay, so we know that the beginning of Paradise Lost is a theodicy. And a theodicy, traditionally speaking, is an approach to this problem that three statements are considered true: God is all powerful, God is all good, evil exists. And how a theodicy tries to explain how God can be both good and powerful and yet have evil exist. Now, this little graphic suggests that it has to do with the free will of humans. Fine. So this is a theodicy, this soliloquy. Adam's wrestling with what things mean and how he can be punished and God can be just and who he is, and he's wrestling with all these things. So here's some examples of other famous theodicies. The most famous theodicy from the Old Testament is the book of Job, who loses everything and wrestles with the meaning of life in a very profound way. This is the text from the 1611 King James Bible. Let the day perish wherein I was born, Job says, and the night in which it was said, this is a man-child conceived. Let that day be darkness, let not God regard it from above, neither let the light shine upon it. Let darkness and the shadow of death stain it, let a cloud dwell upon it, let the blackness of the day terrify it. He's cursing the day of his birth, wishing he had never been born. We also have the story of Samson, which is from the book of Judges, which is then retold by Milton in Samson Agonistes, which is great, in 1671. In that poem, this 2,700-year-old story is retold, and Samson says, to live a life half dead, a living death, and buried, but oh, yet more miserable. Myself, my sepulchre, a moving grave. He calls himself a moving grave. Satan says, myself, uh, am evil. Evil is wherever I go, right? Nothing good or bad, but thinking makes it so. It's that line that like our reality is more of a state of mind than a geographical place. yet not exempt by privilege of death and burial from worst other evils, pains, and wrongs. It's saying, my life is a living grave, a moving grave. This is worse than being dead. So these sort of like profound existential moments from characters like Job and Samson, where they're just in abject fear of their predicament, are so important. We also have the Gospel of Matthew. Jesus himself has very brief, I think it might be heretical to call them strict theodicies, but we have the King James Version of the Bible, and we have a moment from the Garden of Gethsemane where Jesus temporarily wishes for his destiny to pass him by, his destiny to die for all of mankind. Oh, my Father, if this cup may not pass away from me, except I drink it, thy will be done. He quickly, because he's Jesus, he quickly agrees to ascend to God's will, but not before he wrestles with it, albeit temporarily. And then on the cross itself, Jesus, speaking what I believe is Aramaic, quotes the Psalms, quotes David's Psalms, which are also a theodicy. And about the ninth hour, Jesus cried with a loud voice, saying, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani, that is to say, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? The point is, there are moments in sort of literary history where characters are in an awful place and they wrestle with the meaning of things and they despair. Paradise Lost, the Odyssey, is stated right away. Right away. This is a terrible joke, right? One should never have John Milton over for game night. Whenever he's around, there is a pair of dice lost. Yes, haha. I couldn't resist. You have to lighten it up a little bit. I may assert eternal providence, and here's the goal: to justify the ways of God to men. Job and Samson and Jesus, St. Augustine later, all these characters try to reconcile their own personal circumstances with the very power and goodness of God. And this is what really the goal of the poem is. So, Adam's soliloquy, if you go to line 720 of your book, is really important. So the context of it is Adam and Eve separate, fighting. They're in mutual accusation, it says in the poem. And here we have, I've broken up the speech into a few sections. So part one is largely centered on what I consider to be a self-centered sort of helplessness. The focus is all on himself, his thoughts, his feelings, his reactions. He actually has 17 pronouns, either first or third pronouns, that refer to himself. The very sonic sort of pulse of this section is constantly reminding us that he's purely inward. So this is Adam. He refers to himself, he apostrophizes himself by saying, "O miserable of happy." In other words, I am miserable. I am misery itself, where I used to be happiness itself. O miserable of happy. Is this the end of this new glorious world? In me so late, the glory of that glory, who now become accursed of blessed. Hide me from the face of God, whom to behold was then my height of happiness. Yet well, if here would end the misery, I deserved it, and would bear my own deservings. But this will not serve. All that I eat or drink or shall beget is propagated curse. And then he can't stop thinking about what he had. O voice once heard delightfully, increase and multiply now, death to hear. For what can I increase or multiply but curses on my head? Who, of all ages to succeed, but feeling the evil on him brought by me, will curse my head? Ill fare our ancestor impure. For this we may thank Adam. He actually stops and imagines how his ancestors will address him, and that they will curse Adam for their own fallenness. But his thanks shall be the execration. So, beside mine own that bide upon me, all from me shall with a fierce reflux on me redound. On me, as on their natural center, light, heavy, though in their place. So I'm going to get all the blame for this. Oh, fleeting joys. And here's a moment that, just please mark this if you're my student, because the novel Frankenstein, which we're going to read, the quotation that precedes the novel is this quotation. Did I request thee, maker? This is part two, by the way. I'm sorry. Pause. So that first part, completely self-centered. What are my ancestors going to think? How do I feel? What do I remember? I. Part two, The self-dialectic, self-questioning continues. He starts reflecting on eternity. It gets a little more conceptual, which is interesting. It says, "Did I request thee, Maker, from my clay to mold me, man? I didn't ask to be created." You can see why Mary Shelley chose this, right? The creature in Frankenstein could have very well said these words. "Did I solicit thee from darkness to promote me? Or my place in this delicious garden, as here's an important line, as my will concurred not to my being, it were but right and equal to reduce me to my dust." My will concurred not to my being. In other words, who I am mentally didn't go with who I am as a human being, he says. You made me to break. "Desirous to resign and render back all I received, unable to perform thy terms, too hard, by which I was to hold the good I sought not. To the loss of that, sufficient penalty. What hast thou added," he says to God, "the sense of endless woes?" Like, okay, you're penalizing me, you're adding to that eternal woe. "Inexplicable thy justice seems," he says to God. "Yet, to say truth, too late I thus contest, then should have refused those terms whatsoever when they were proposed. I should have not gone along with the don't eat from the fruit deal before I fell," he said. And then the thou goes from talking about God to talking about himself. But it isn't really self-centered. He's being sort of not self-delusional here. He says, "You accepted them. Thou did accept these terms." And he says again to himself, "Wilt thou enjoy the good?" And then cavil or object to the conditions. You're going to enjoy everything God gives you, but then hedge your bets when you don't follow through with the deal he made. "And though God made thee," talking about himself, "without thy leave," it's so weird. He says, God made me, even though God made me without my permission, what if thy son proved disobedient? What if I have kids someday, Adam says, and they prove disobedient, he proves disobedient, and reproved say to me, "Wherefore didst thou beget me?" What if Cain or Abel someday say to me, "Well, why did you have kids? I didn't seek to be born. I sought it not." Adam's aware all by himself, just having a minute to think. He says a ridiculous thing that maybe I didn't ask to be born. Why am I being punished? To then realizing, I'm going to have kids someday. What if they say this to me? He says to himself, "Wouldst thou admit for his contempt of thee that proud excuse? Would you go along with what Cain and Abel said? Yet him, my son, not thy election, but natural necessity begot." Sorry about the spacing. I was created by God kind of perfectly. Any future kids I have are going to be, birthed differently than I was created. And he says to himself, "God made thee, Adam, of choice his own, and of his own to serve him." He says to himself, "Thy reward was of his grace. Thy punishment then justly is at his will. Be it so." Satan very rarely says "be it so" when he soliloquizes. Although Satan gets to this point where he knows that what God's asking for is reasonable, that following God, that service wasn't hard, right? So far so good. "Be it so, for I submit. God's doom is fair," Adam says. Again, Satan says the same thing earlier. Adam says, and it was just Ask Wednesday, so great, "That dust I am, and shall to dust return." And then Adam goes dark. A welcome hour whenever, right? This is borrowing a page from "Oh, that the two solid flesh would melt, thaw, and resolve itself into a dew. Oh, that the Almighty had not fixed his canon against self-slaughter." It's Hamlet's first soliloquy in Act 1, Scene 2 of Hamlet. This is Adam here. I wish I could just die then. Why delays God's hands to execute what his decree fixed on this day? I was told today I was going to die. What's he waiting for? Logical question. "Why do I overlive?" Adam says. "Why am I mocked with death and lengthened out to deathless pain?" And then the ultimate despair. "How gladly would I meet mortality, my sentence." This is what Job said. This is what Samson says, right? How gladly would I meet mortality, my sentence, and be earth insensible. Oh, that this too solid flesh would melt, thaw, and resolve itself into a dew. It's Hamlet 2.0. Or maybe Hamlet's Adam 2.0. I don't know. How glad would lay me down as in my mother's lap. There, the earth, I should rest and sleep secure. His dreadful voice no more would thunder in my ears. No fear of worse to me and to my offspring would torment me with cruel expectation. So he ponders the potential blessings of death. Now, part 3, really fascinating, and this is what turned me on to this poem when I read it for the first time. He deduces the immortality of the soul just by having a moment to think. He says, "Yet one doubt pursues me still, lest all I cannot die, lest that pure breath of life, the spirit of man which God inspired, cannot together perish with this corporeal clod. Maybe the body dies, but there's something eternal that doesn't." Then Adam says, "Then in the grave or some other dismal place, who knows, but I shall die a living death? Oh, thought horrid if true, yet why? It was but breath of life that sinned. What dies but what had life and sin? The body properly hath neither. All of me then shall die. Let this appease the doubt, since human reach no further knows, for though the Lord of all be infinite, is his wrath also infinite? Be it, man is not so, but mortal doomed." Listen to this brilliant question, and be mindful, Adam's education of Raphael was narrative. Raphael doesn't teach him philosophy 101, he teaches him stories. Adam does this. He says, how can God exercise wrath without end on man whom death must end, right? If man has to be subject to eternal wrath, there has to be a part of man that's eternal for that to be the case. Adam figures this out all by himself. And Adam says that would make strange contradiction. And then he realizes, which to God himself impossible itself. God can't do contradictions. As argument of weakness, not of power. Will God draw out, for anger's sake, finite to infinite in punished man to satisfy his rigor? Satisfied never? Thou were to extend his sentence beyond dust and nature's law, by which all causes else, according still to the reception of their matter, act, not to the extent of their own sphere. But say that death be not one stroke, as I supposed. Bereaving sense. Look how flexible Adam is intellectually. Bereaving sense. But let's say death's endless misery from this day onward, which I feel begun both in me and without me, and so lasts to perpetuity. Now, Adam does land in despair, but it's a very informed despair. Ay me, that fear comes thundering back with dreadful revolution on my defenseless head. Both death and I am found eternal and incorporate both, nor I on my part single. In me all posterity stands cursed. Okay, now this is the mind-blowing part. Last part was amazing for its philosophical precision. This part is amazing because this man who is now fallen suddenly becomes Christ-like. He addresses the children he doesn't have yet and the ancestors that are not born yet. He says, fair patrimony, that I must leave ye, sons. Underline this. Were I able to waste it all myself and leave you none. That's what Jesus Christ comes for. Before the incarnation and Christmas and the passion and death and resurrection, Milton has Adam immediately after his fall wish to take all of mankind's sin on himself. He went from a completely self-absorbed lament in the first part of this speech to deducing the immortality of the soul, to then wishing to love his ancestors not yet born so much that he wishes he could sacrifice himself so that they would be spared the punishment that was his fault. So disinherited, how would you, my ancestors, bless me, now your curse? Why should all mankind, for one man's fault, thus guiltless, be condemned? it guiltless? It's a legitimate question. But from me, what can proceed? But all will be corrupt, both mind and will depraved, not to do only, but to will the same with me. How can they then acquitted stand in sight of God? Him, after all disputes, forced I absolve, all my evasions vain. All my little arguments and tricks and thoughts, none of it matters, Adam realizes. And reasonings, though through mazes, lead me still to my own conviction. First and last, on me only, as the source and spring of all corruption, all the blame lights do. So might the wrath. Fond wish. So he wishes he could take on the burden of what Christ bears, and he can't. Because as we know from St. Anselm's treatise, Cur Deus Homo, Why God Became Man, Adam and Eve's sin was a sin made by a man. So a man needs to make up for it. But it was a sin committed against God. So a God has to make up for it. So the only creature that could enact redemption is a God-man, Jesus Christ. Adam's not that. Fond wish, he says to himself, couldst thou support that burden heavier than the earth to bear, than all the world much heavier, though divided with that bad woman. Thus, a conclusion, here we go. He says to himself, what thou desirest and what thou fearest alike destroys all hope of refuge, and concludes thee miserable beyond all past example and future. To Satan only, like both crime and doom. And then he apostrophizes himself early on, O miserable if happy. Then he apostrophizes conscience, that capacity to know and make choices. He says, then remember Hamlet. Thus conscience doth make cowards of us all. Hamlet concludes his to-be speech. Adam concludes here, and I have to think Milton has Hamlet in his head. Conscience, into what abyss of fears and horrors hast thou driven me, out of which I find no way, from deeper to deeper plunged. And then an amazing speech. So just some thoughts. I have 5 thoughts about why I care about this speech and why I think it matters. Maybe you want to jot them down or ignore them. Up to you. 1. What's gonna come? Book 11 and 12. Adam learning about all of salvation history. Only matters if he knows his own nature, if he knows the immortality of the soul and how a piece of him will last forever, if he knows the nature of what death looks like, if he believes in God's divine justice and the overall stakes of human choices. He has to do this thinking for the rest of the poem to sink for him, to matter to him. 2, I think a lot of this poem is not simply Milton justifying the ways of God to man. I think God, at various times, I think early in the poem, God's explaining before Adam and Eve are created that they're going to fall and then they're going to blame him and that they're ingrates. But God's foreknowledge did not mean they didn't make choices. God is justifying God's ways to God there. At various moments, Satan tries to justify things. This is Adam justifying the ways of God to Adam, I think, and then by association, us. This has to happen. 3rd, I think for the epic to work, Satan is so formidable and layered and brilliant and fascinating, but just like a play like Hamlet, Hamlet can't be the only person like that. It's not a one-man show. So Eve in book 9, as we saw, brilliant, fascinating, layered. Adam hasn't been interesting yet, at least relative to Eve, relative to Satan. He is now. And we know this because he got a narrative education, as I said before, and suddenly he's able to deduce all these very significant, profound philosophical truths just from his own God-given mind, broken though it may be. 4th, I think one of the reasons why we might just be fascinated by Satan exclusively is informed by Stanley Fish's landmark book, Surprised by Sin. He says that our love for the fallen demon is largely because we're imperfect, we're broken, we're fallen, and we're sort of the main character of the story, actually. His book, Surprised by Sin, is worth time. So that's a thought. And then 5th, and I think most importantly, Adam is built for thinking and reason, he's told. Reason is one of the greatest human capacities God gives mankind. He gives it to them differently than all of his other creatures during creation. It's the angels and mankind have that. And interestingly enough, reason isn't enough. That you need to love God in Paradise Lost and obey him, even when you don't necessarily understand why. And characters like Satan cannot do that. We're going to see if Adam and Eve can. I hope this video is helpful, and good luck with your reading.